Hello everyone. Thank you again for joining us today and welcome to the second session of the Great Rethink. I'm James P. Barbieri. I'm the Associate Program Director at the PARI Center and I'll be your host for today. Today with me we also have Eleanor Peat, the Program Director of the PARI Center, and David Lorimer, Director of the Scientific and Medical Network. And they will both assist me and you during this phone call. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules for this session. First of all, during the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphone just to ensure the better quality audio. But at the same time, we also encourage people to turn on their camera, as we believe it creates a nice, inclusive educational environment. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution during the second half of the session, which is the Q&A, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom. You can find that in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, you can just put your question in the chat box. And throughout the session, you feel free to use the chat box, as it's a nice way to share your thoughts with other participants. And finally, the session is recorded. The recordings will be available later in the week, but the recordings will not include the breakaway rooms, just so everyone's aware. And with that, we can begin the event. For the people who weren't with us this morning, today we welcome Colin Tudge, a biologist and writer who founded the Oxford Real Farming Conference Global, a center and movement dedicated to disseminate and explore the ideas in agroecology and other ideas included in his latest publication, The Great Rethink. And today, as a special guest for this session, we also welcome Denise Walton.
Do you want me to begin?
Who's a farmer.
Something wrong with the sound, sorry.
I think it's a problem with James's Wi-Fi. Can you mute James?
Yeah, he's frozen altogether.
Go ahead, Colin. Yeah, go ahead, Colin. You can start.
Okay. So, for coming back. This is the book that I'm sort of... The thing is, can we have the first slide, please, James or David, whoever's doing it?
James should be doing it, but he's a bit frozen at the moment.
Slide 2.
Introducing you, I think.
Anyways, 2.0 to what we're actually going to be talking about this afternoon, followed by slide 1.2. Let's jump straight to slide 1.
Well, let me try and do that. Well, because he's disappeared altogether now.
Yeah, he's having Wi-Fi troubles. I just called him.
Okay, wait a minute. Stand by. Let me just get the right slides. Escape here. Oh, he's come back. Okay.
Technical hitches.
Yeah, I'm just looking.
I can't at all myself.
Window.
I talk about
PARI session 2.
Pardon?
That's number 2.
Anyway, this morning I introduced the whole thesis, which is what we need to do to put the world to rights, basically. Great Rethink. I showed a diagram, which I hope we can still show at some point, which showed all the things we need to think about, and they were in 4 tiers. And the top tier was defining what we want to achieve. It could be about to come on. Now that's the first one with, that shows what this one's about. There's a picture of Denise, who hasn't turned up yet, but she will be here later, I do hope, later. And the point is, can we show the other one now, 1.2, the next one?
Okay, hang on.
The one before this. Anyway, My argument is that to put things to rights, to put the world to rights, there's so much wrong with the world you can hardly begin to describe it. I did describe it this morning, but there's so much wrong. We have to rethink on every front, across the board. Furthermore, we have to rethink everything in the light of everything else. And the diagram, which I hope will turn up sooner or later, shows this, all the things we need to rethink, and the fact that they need to be rethought altogether to give a sort of holistic.
I'm going to put the diagram up, but it's in a different PowerPoint, so I have to come out and then come in again. But you carry on talking. I'll get the diagram for you.
The diagram shows it's present all the things we need to think about in 4 tiers. And the top tier is called goal and defines what it is we're trying to achieve. The next one down is called action and defines the kind of things we need to do in order to achieve the kind of things we need to do. Here we are, here it is. Good. The third one down is about the infrastructure that we need in order to be able to support the actions that we need. And the fourth one, the bottom one, is about mindset. The goal, I think we always have to keep in mind, so I'll repeat it. And the goal, as far as I'm concerned, for the whole society, for all human beings for all time, basically, is to achieve convivial societies with personal fulfillment within a flourishing biosphere. In other words, individuals matter, personal fulfillment, society matters, and the whole living world matters, the biosphere. So that should be the goal. Now, the action that's required is what we're going to talk about this afternoon. The action that's required includes all technologies, but the most important technologies, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll try and justify this later, are those of agriculture, and particularly of something I'm calling enlightened agriculture, and of food culture, of cooking, in fact. The point being that no matter, however you farm, a farmer can't survive unless society at large actually is geared to what the farmer produces. So cooking is sort of complementary to agriculture and is at least as important. And in fact, the world, I would say the world should be led, the whole world. Everything we do, I think, well, it should be built around the idea of the convivial society and so on. But in detail, I think the whole economy and the whole of politics should be built primarily around the ideas of agriculture and food culture, cooking. And and farming itself, agriculture, should, I think, be driven and led by people at large who know how to cook. So I see cooking as supremely important. In my society in Britain, cooking was dropped more or less from schools as a sort of standard subject in the 1970s on political grounds. And the idea was then a sort of twisted form of feminism that teaching cookery tended to enslave women because it kept them in the kitchen. The exact opposite is true, of course. Cooking is the great liberating technology which enables us all to be, if we choose, to be independent of the powers that be, the hierarchy. So it's supremely important practically and, of course, for political, social reasons. I want to talk first of all about, well, we've got the 3 things here: appropriate technology, enlightened agriculture, and food culture. I want to talk first about appropriate technology. Could I have the next slide, please? That's 2.1.
Okay, hang on. I need to escape first and then go into a different screen. So hang on a second.
Okay. It's great. I'll carry on because it basically, slide 2.1 says what I've just said, but that's good. When it comes to talking about appropriate technology, in this country at least, I think the world over, people are very good, or quite good, at teaching individual technologies, like, well, whatever it is, mechanics, farming, anything you like to mention, electrical engineering. But what is not taught, I think, very often at a very high level is the philosophy of technology. The philosophy of science is hardly taught at all, but as a formal regular subject. But the philosophy of technology seems to me to be largely abandoned. Now, as James said earlier, we are in the process of founding something called the College for Real Farming and Food Culture. And the whole idea of the philosophy of technology, as well as the philosophy of science, will be very high on the agenda. There's a huge literature on what you might call the philosophy of technology, about what it really is, what it's really for, how you gear it to the real needs of society, and so on and so on and so on. But the crux of it all, the crux of it is that whatever we do, into all the technologies, must be geared to the idea of convivial societies and in convivial societies and a flourishing biosphere. That has to be the purpose of everything we do, I'm suggesting. And the purpose has to be a good purpose, and that is a good purpose. Now, technologies and the whole, the fundamental concept is that of appropriate technology as laid out by Schumacher in the early 70s in his book, Small is Beautiful. That's a sort of thing. There is, however, I think I've lost a page here. No, I haven't. There is, however, a, where am I going? There's a page gone missing. The philosophy of technology that I describe in my book, I refer in particular to a whole list of about eight or nine different thinkers on this. The first is Rousseau at the end of the 18th century. Lots of people were getting very enthusiastic about technology at the end of the 18th century. This was the beginning of the, well, quite well in by then, to the Industrial Revolution. And lots of people were thinking, isn't this brilliant? And people like J.M.W. Turner were painting, well, in the early 19th century, mid-19th century, were painting pictures of steam in a very sort of exuberant way. This is the way forward. And people like James Ward, English painter again, really, and Joseph Wright of Derby, all sort of focusing on what a brilliant thing, painting new industries as if they were a sort of great romantic step forward. But Rousseau was one of the people who pointed out, actually, this is rather nasty. This whole sort of ultra-rationalism applied in this brutal fashion to the natural world. It's overriding values. It's overriding the natural world, beginning really of real romanticism. So I think Rousseau is someone we really need to bring out of the woodwork. The Luddites, the movement in the Midlands and the North in England in the 1820s onwards, they were the guys who were sort of, well, among other things, they started breaking up the machines that were doing the weaving and the spinning because it was putting them out of work. Now, the Luddites are often seen nowadays and taught in history as really bad people who are just against progress and against anything that was, you know, well, against progress, basically, just stuck in the mud, just interested in nostalgia and continuing sort of old-fashioned ways of doing things. In fact, of course, they were actually trying to say to the world at large, look, what is it you really want technology to do? And at the moment, we have these societies based on crafts, weaving, etc., etc. And you people come along with your machines and you put us all out of work and you destroy what labor really is. And why is that considered to be a good thing? That you destroy societies just to make money for a few people? They raise this question, but now for a long time, they were simply despised as backsliders. Another person I quote, and we talked about him loosely this morning, was John Ruskin, who was, one of the things he said was, look, he stole the virtues of craft. And he said what he really liked real Gothic architecture, sort of proper sort of 13th, 14th century stuff, because he said, then you can see each chisel mark and you can see the actual craftsman himself at work on the stones, his human impression on these wonderful buildings. Whereas he said, nowadays you can knock these things out with modern technologies, and it's just not the same. It's just an imitation, etc., etc. And he was a guy who really, again, showed the real virtue of craft. One of the discussions we ought to have, and perhaps if we're having a breakout, is why do people bother with craft when you can do most of the things that craftsmen do, or craftswomen, with modern manufacturing, a tenth of the time, half the cost, tenth of the cost, etc. It's a good discussion to have, but there are good reasons why you should continue with the craft. William Morris is another guy I quote from the sort of mid to late 19th century, early 20th even, where he said, look, I don't mind, let's say William Morris, don't mind manufacture. And he says there's a lots of things we should do by manufacture that we now do by hand. But on the other hand, craft remains vitally important as a sort of human expression. And if we sacrifice craft, we sacrifice our humanness. We must, in other words, maintain the both in balance. There's no real feeling of that, I would say, in the modern world, not much anyway. Another guy I quote is Peter Kropotkin, Russian, obviously, who was one of the people who pointed out after Darwin that nature isn't as frenetically competitive as Darwin said it was, that actually nature is very considerably cooperative. And in much the same kind of way, he was obviously a socialist, believed in building societies, etc. And he again talked about the need for craft, in other words, for human beings to keep their hands on the things of life that actually matter. And again, I quote Tolstoy as a wonderful passage from Tolstoy, of course, a great aristocrat who also liked to live like a peasant. And there is wonderful passage from Anna Karenina, where this character Lenin, who is actually the sort of alter ego of Tolstoy, goes to work alongside the peasants in the field, scything with a little group that's led by this chap called Titus. And I just read you a little bit because it sort of summarizes a lot of what I want to say. This is talking about Levin, alias Tolstoy. He swung his scythe, using his last ounce of strength, and was making up his mind to ask Titus to stop. But at that very moment, Titus stopped of his own accord, bent down and picked up a handful of grass, wiped his scythe, and began whetting it, whetting with a W, whetting. Levin straightened his back and looked round with a sigh of relief. The same thing happened next time. Titus moved on with a sweep after sweep of his scythe, not stopping and not tiring. Levin followed, trying to keep up and finding it harder and harder until the moment came when he felt he had no strength left. But at that very moment, Titus stopped and whetted the scythes. Then it goes on. There were moments when he forgot what he was doing. He moved without effort. But as soon as he began thinking what he was doing, he would mow badly. The longer Levin mowed, the oftener he experienced those moments of oblivion when the scythe seemed to mow of itself, a body full of life and consciousness of its own, as though by magic. These were the most blessed moments. And what Tolstoy is talking about there, I think, more than anything, is this whole idea of fulfillment. And I suggested right up front that what we should be trying to achieve is convivial societies with personal fulfillment. And there's this terrible tendency these days to think that fulfillment simply means, well, not to use the word fulfillment, but to use the word happiness. And the word happiness is, or the concept of happiness is too often equated with the idea of hedonism. And hedonism is often equated with the idea of leisure. And so somehow we have all these industries and technologies which are designed to improve leisure. Well, leisure doesn't necessarily lead to fulfillment at all. And of course, there's nothing worse than the enforced leisure being put out of work because of some technology. The next character I quote in my book is Gandhi, who, of course, wasn't against manufacture, but he said, if human beings at large are going to sort of reclaim their inheritance, reclaim freedom from big rulers like the British or industry or something, they have to be in charge of their own crafts, their own ways of living. And of course, he was the great advocate of spinning, the spinning wheel, and as a way of asserting political independence. And the next character I quote, Gandhi, incidentally, was a great friend of Tolstoy, and they corresponded until Tolstoy died in 1910, and then Gandhi was on his own. The next character I quote is Ivan Illich, the Austrian philosopher, also a Jesuit, who coined the expression tools for conviviality. And it was there that I got the expression convivial, the idea of conviviality, rather than sort of happiness and efficiency and all those other horrible terms. And Illich points out the way Illich thought of conviviality or convivial technology was a technology that liberates people, individuals, and enables them to achieve fulfillment on their own terms. And the kind of technologies he thought were convivial were those, well, for example, he singled out the bicycle. He said, anybody can mend a bicycle. In theory, many people could actually make a bicycle. And the bicycle is wonderfully liberating because, well, instead of being confined to your own village, you can go around the countryside and do all those things. So he saw that as the ultimately convivial technology, together with the telephone, which enabled everybody to talk to everybody else. What he hated in those days was broadcasting, because he said with broadcasting, it's a one-way process, that the bosses, the powers that be speak to the masses and the masses can't speak back. Well, nowadays they can, of course, with the aid of modern technology, IT. So actually modern IT is convivial in the Illichian sense. I find that quite interesting, a very high tech that is actually convivial in theory. Anyway, Illich, very important thinker. And then the last one, I don't think anybody's improved on since really, was of course Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, who coined the idea that technologies had to be appropriate, meaning, in my opinion, technologies that create convivial societies, etc., etc., etc. People seem to think that appropriate technology necessarily means what you might call low technology or artisanal technology. In other words, people commonly think that the horse and cart is appropriate if you happen to live in a poor society, whereas high tech isn't. Well, that's not the way to divide it up, actually, because for example, one of the most useful technologies for small farmers in remote places is the mobile telephone. And that's very, very high tech. So actually what you really need is a mixture, judicious mixture of high technologies, which are science-based technologies, and what you might call low technologies that people have got real control of. And again, that's not the kind of thinking that is at the moment being pursued. Again, when you think about science, what I think is the kind of ideal compromise is what I'm calling science-assisted craft. You can see something like the horse and cart as being an appropriate technology because it's village scale, anybody can do it, etc., etc. But to make horses and carts really work well, it's not a bad idea to have a few modern technologies thrown in. For example, carts tend to work much better if they have rubber tires, and rubber tires are undoubtedly high tech. Often, though, what you find is that when Western countries try to do good for poorer countries, what they do is to impose high tech of one kind or another, when actually the solution would lie with doing much, much simpler things which aren't high tech at all. And for example, I was in India about 20 years ago and talking to various villagers about milking. And the British, bless their souls, were intent on introducing Holstein Friesian cattle. very, very high yielding, etc. But they only were very, very high yielding if you fed them very, very well and gave them plenty of water. And the one thing the Indian villagers didn't have was a lot of spare cattle feed that they could simply give to cattle. And they certainly didn't have any water. And the cattle that were actually appropriate to that village were the traditional kinds, the old zebu type of things, or humped cattle, which could make do on next to nothing and hardly needed any water and thrived even when the weather was, well, they were basically when it was kind of weather that would kill a Holstein, these animals could thrive on. However, I remember I asked them very naively, look, you produce more milk with these old-fashioned cattle than you can possibly drink. Why don't you sell the surpluses to the local village where you and actually get a bit of money as well as feeding yourselves? And they looked at me rather pityingly and said, well, actually, our cattle, any cattle, don't really yield well, don't really produce a surplus except in the rainy season. And during the rainy season, the roads are impassable. So what you see there in microcosm is a sort of one of the principal mistakes of the modern world, that we laid them, we impose high technologies on poor countries, when actually what was really needed and what's appropriate is something really quite simple, quite basic. I got in, one of my heroes in agriculture has just died, called Bob Orskov, who was a great sort of animal man who looked at these kind of rare breeds and so on, or ancient breeds in the third world, as Gandhi called it. And he made this point, but I can't remember what I was going to say now. What was I going to say? Yeah. Anyway, just as this is a spurious link to Denise when she turns up, that he was one of the great animal nutritionists. And although he was born as a sort of peasant farmer in Denmark, anyway, he used to make the point that I can't remember, what was I going to say? Yes. He went, this is a spurious link, but I'll throw it in anyway. He went to work at what was then called the Macaulay Institute in Aberdeen, where, among others, he continued his studies on animal nutrition. The Macaulay Institute was later renamed the James Hutton Institute after James Hutton, the great late 18th century Scottish earth scientist. When I first met Denise Walton, who I hope will be here in a few minutes.
No, she is.
What?
She's here.
Is she here?
Yeah.
Oh, great, Denise. We had a very pleasant talk at some meeting that was there to launch the Slow Food Club, and we talked about James Hutton. And I'm hoping that Denise will also talk a bit about James Hutton this afternoon. But there is the spurious link between me, Bob Orskov, Indian cattle, and James Hutton and Denise. Jolly good. Other people I think we should really be discussing in the context of the philosophy of technology include people like Pugin, who were Corbusier, Henry Ford, Tim Berners-Lee, Bill Gates, or the Potter, Grayson Perry, all these characters, some of them very much on the side of craft, some of them in effect sweeping aside craft. Again, as I think I said earlier, one question we really should be asking is, why do we bother with craft of any kind when we can make things more cheaply by various forms of manufacture? And that's something that really should be discussed at length. However, can I have slide 2.2, please?
This is 2.
This is just to illustrate that a general theme of action and the three big things: appropriate technology. Now, what I want to say is that of all the technologies we need to consider, and we need to consider all technologies, two are absolutely outstanding. One is agriculture, and the other is cooking, which is the complement of agriculture. And the kind of agriculture we need is the concept of agriculture, the kind of agriculture we need is what I'm calling enlightened agriculture, otherwise known as real farming, as in the Oxford Real Farming Conference, the Real Farming Trust, and our own college, the College for Real Farming and Food Culture. And the point is, agriculture is as important as it is because it's right at the center of all human affairs and all the world's affairs. If we don't get agriculture right, humanity is in very, very deep trouble, as we in of course already are. If we don't get agriculture right, if we don't farm in wildlife friendly ways, I think the whole cause of wildlife conservation is almost dead in the water. At least it's very, very highly compromised. Absolutely got to get it right. It ought to be the thing then that all governments take very, very seriously. It should be the thing they take most seriously of all. And in fact, they don't. Governments like ours regard, because they're sort of high tech and they've got their head in the clouds and all the rest of it, I mean, focused on money, regard agriculture as a kind of also ran. And they have it in mind that we could, in Britain, you know, it's sort of difficult to farm cheaply because the land is so dear and so on and so on. And many governments for the last 200 and something years, successive governments, have thought that possibly we should not bother with agriculture at all in this country, Britain, but should be importing all our food from abroad. And the last people, to my knowledge, to think seriously along those lines was the Blair government of the 1990s. And because they were really happy that agriculture should have gone the same way as miners, as from the same reach and the same reason, that it was much cheaper to buy food from America and Africa, basically, and the Ukraine, than it was to grow it at home. So why grow it at home? All we really needed was money. And this was the mentality that was paramount in Britain at that time and throughout the world, really. And it's very much in line with the economic system of neoliberalism, that everything should be done as cheaply as possible. But of course, it's deeply pernicious. And every now and again, governments in Britain were woken up to the fact that if you don't have home agriculture, homegrown agriculture, you can be in deep shtuck. And the first time they realized that was at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, early 19th century, when suddenly there was a blockade. They couldn't import, in those days, particularly cheap grain from America. And then then they sort of went back after the wars died down to the importing of stuff from abroad idea. And that, again, they were brought up short in the First World War, where again, import was difficult. And then again, they allowed agriculture to lapse so the 1930s, agriculture in Britain was extremely picturesque. And people like my mother had a memory of agriculture in those days, farmland being wonderfully full of flowers and all sorts of stuff, basically because it was neglected, because the government didn't think it was all that important. They didn't think it was all that important until we got to the Second World War and we got the blockade. And then after the Second World War, they started taking it seriously again. Well, again, once the memory of war fades, again, they go back to the old idea that we can just import. And the British government has not taken agriculture seriously. It's regarded it, as the neoliberals say, as a business like any other, which is an expression I first heard in the 1970s. And furthermore, with the sort of neoliberal mentality, they've been redefining business as simply a way of maximizing and concentrating wealth. Whereas the traditional sort of idea of business was that business was a sort of natural economy for a democratic society, where people did things that were socially useful, but they did it in a sort of profitable way. I'll argue later talk session whether that's a good way to approach it. But the point is, they had what one was capitalism, but with a moral base. And with neoliberalism, you've got capitalism with no moral base. It's just there to produce and produce and produce as cheaply as possible. And now we've had neoliberal agriculture rammed down our throats. And it is actually more or less the exact opposite of the kind of agriculture we really need. Can we have, I think there's another slide, slide 2.2, which shows enlightened agriculture. This is the concept of enlightened agriculture that I've been developing over the last sort of 10, 20 years. And enlightened agriculture has, as far as I'm concerned, 3 components. There are 2 up on the screen so far, and the third one might or might not appear a bit later. It doesn't matter. And the first of these components is, agroecology. And agroecology is an idea that dates from the 1920s, and it says we should be treating individual farms as ecosystems, and we should treat agriculture as a whole as a positive contributor to the well-being of the biosphere. The second great principle, which dates from the 1990s and was brought in by the global peasant movement known as La Via Campesina, is that of food sovereignty. And the principle of food sovereignty says that every society should keep control of its own food supply and hence of its own destiny. And the third great principle of enlightened agriculture is green economic democracy, which I'll talk about in the next session, next week. But basically, the point here is that no system, however well conceived, can succeed unless it has a sympathetic economic base. And the sympathetic economic base for agroecology and food sovereignty is that of economic democracy, which you can roughly see what it means from the title, but we'll go into it next week. A point about, let's talk a bit about agroecology. I'll define enlightened agriculture as a whole. Enlightened agriculture as a whole, I define as farming that is expressly designed to provide everyone, everywhere, with food of the highest quality, nutritionally and gastronomically, without injustice, without cruelty, and without wrecking the natural world. Now, this should be eminently possible. Technically, it's not even that difficult. But of course, we're miles and miles away from it. And as I said this morning, the world already produces enough food for 14 billion people, and yet we're still focused on production, because what people are really interested in is profit. The agriculture says that in order to ensure that you're producing good food for everybody forever without wrecking the world, individual farms should be designed as ecosystems, and agriculture as a whole should be seen as a positive contributor to the biosphere. What do we want from agriculture? We want it to be reasonably productive enough. We don't need it to be twice as productive as it needs to be, as it is at the moment. We need it to be sustainable in the sense that we can go on doing it, not necessarily go on doing the same thing, but at least sustainable in the sense that we don't run down the rest of the world. But in a world which is changing, and the world always changes, and it's changing very rapidly at the moment, primarily because of climate change, more than mere sustainability, you need the principle of resilience, which people don't talk about anything like so much. Resilience means that if the agriculture receives a setback for whatever reason, it can recover quite quickly. Or if the setback is too great so that recovery becomes impossible, it can change direction very quickly. Now, if we were looking around for models and say, what can we observe, that is resilient and is also sustainable? Well, just look at wild nature. World nature has been reasonably productive, by no means maximally productive, but reasonably productive, more or less continuously for the better part of 4 billion years, even though in that time the world has changed radically with, for example, 6 mass extinctions caused by volcanic eruption and impact of asteroids and massive climate change as a result of that, and so on and so on and so on. But it's recovered quite quickly in, well, a few million years from all of these enormous setbacks. So we should be asking the question, what does nature do that enables it to be so sustainable and so resilient? What does it do that we can copy, basically, emulate? We don't want to emulate everything that nature does, because nature can also be extremely destructive, but we want to emulate these particular qualities of sustainability and resilience. What does it do to achieve this? Well, one thing is that wild nature is wonderfully diverse. Thousands and thousands of species typically in any one ecosystem, and that gives it tremendous resilience. You knock out one and others will take over, and at different times different members of the ecosystem will come to the fore and then die away. Wild nature in general is low input. You look at the sort of fertility, for example, of a tropical rainforest, very, very, very low. Actually, all the fertility is in the trees themselves and the wildlife that feeds on the trees. But most wild ecosystems are of low fertility. And the only times you find high fertility is when you get, for example, an estuary, when all the nutrients come down from the land and are concentrated in a few mudflats, or, for example, in the Antarctic, where the warm currents full of stuff hit the cold currents and go shooting up to the surface, and you get lots of plankton and all that. But except for hotspots of that kind, wild nature is low input. And the third thing is that all these diverse creatures living in these very rather frugal conditions are very interactive and synergistic. Come back to the point that nature is fundamentally cooperative rather than competitive. The essence of it is this cooperation. Now, let us ask, how do these 3 principles of diversity, low input, and synergy translate into farming? And the answer is, well, diversity is achieved by having mixed farming, fairly obviously, different classes of livestock and crops. Also by having genetic variation within each class of livestock and each variety of crops. And again, nowadays there's a tendency to produce crops that are extremely, or livestock that are extremely uniform genetically, because that gives you easier control over what's called the product, and it's better for sort of mass manufacturing purposes to have absolute uniformity. But absolute uniformity means that you have equal susceptibility to disease. So if you want to have a really spectacular epidemic, get your animals and your plants as genetically uniform as possible. And that's precisely what we do. And so in order to counteract that, we have more and more pesticide and herbicide and fungicide and all the rest of it, which is so that farming as a whole actually becomes a sort of branch of the agrochemical industry. That's not the way to do it. Low input, low fertility. This is achieved by organic farming. Organic farming is often still seen as a kind of middle-class indulgence. In fact, it's the proper way to farm, the sort of basic traditional way to farm. And this is what we need to do again in the future. And organic farming can be much, much more productive than it usually is at the moment. What you need for organic farming is very, very good technique and very, very good science. And actually, some of it is very good scientifically, very good technically, but it's in this country, for example, and I think the world over, we spend about only 10% of the total biological research budget on organic farming, and yet it might be less than that. And yet, this is actually the way ahead. And the synergy means on a farm means, well, for example, you used to see it in the mixed farms of the 1950s in this country, where the farmer would have barley and he would feed the surplus to pigs, for example. And he would also have a dairy farm, and he would produce butter, and the whey from the butter production would also go to feed the pigs, and so on and so on. And when the arable was, when he'd had a few seasons of cereal, he would put livestock on the fields to manure them and so on, and everything was working together with everything else. Well, nowadays in the modern neoliberal farm, you have monocultures, and you have entire areas that are devoted just to one crop only. And examples of that, there are arable farms in the Ukraine that are as big as an English county, and it's wall-to-wall wheat from one end to the other. And there was a chap on the radio the other day complaining that he had 3,000 acres, which is huge in my opinion, of rapeseed, which I find as a quite appalling crop, really. And he was being besieged or beset by beetles, click beetles. And he was complaining because the insecticides known as neonicotinoids were being banned or restricted. And he said, how can I protect my vast acres of rape without, because we're all uniform, without sticking on loads and loads of neonics? Well, the answer is you can't. But the other answer is that you shouldn't be growing 3,000 acres of a monocrop in the first place. In other words, what you've got there is a monoculture with the absolute absence of anything resembling synergy. If you go down the agroecological route, you finish up with farms that are very, very complex. I mean, organic farming, to do it well, is complex. And of course, the farms are mixed, and a mixed farm is very complex. If you have a farm that is very, very mixed or very complex, any enterprise that is very complex needs lots and lots of skill to make it work. So to make enlightened agriculture work, you need a big skilled workforce, loads and loads of farmers and growers. If you have an enterprise, any enterprise that is complex and skills intensive, there's no real advantage in scale up. So that the farm of an enlightened kind is going to finish up being small to medium sized. This is in accord with the principle of agroecology. It's also obviously in accord with the principle of food democracy. Societies can much more easily keep control of food, small farms, which they can own, than of these vast estates which cost tens and tens of millions. Note, however, that the kind of industrial farms that are now taking over, what I call neoliberal industrial farms, but are sometimes called conventional farms, are the complete opposite of this, because they're actually geared to the maximization and the concentration of wealth. And if you want to maximize and concentrate wealth, you want to focus above all on production, even though we've already got much more than we need. And the way to achieve maximum production with the kind of crops that we've got now is by whacking on loads and loads of industrial chemistry, huge inputs, not reducing, but huge inputs. And if you have huge inputs, you're using fertilizer on a vast scale, and you're growing monocultures, you're maximizing output. By that means you finish up with monocultures, and you're looking for simplicity. You finish up with monocultures, and the best way to raise a monoculture is not by having loads and loads of skilled farmers, but by having a dedicated machine that will simply focus on the single task that the farm does. So again, the farm that's geared to money is going to be very mechanized and very, very simplified, a monoculture. The complete opposite, absolute opposite of what we really need, which is the small mixed, etc. farm. There was a guy in the 1960s and a bit later in the United States called Earl Butts, who said to farmers as a whole, get big or get out. And that mentality still persists. It works if money is all you're interested in, only so long as inputs are cheap, so long as oil is available and oil is cheap, it'll work. But it won't work for very long because, as we all know, if you simply go for maximum yield and you simply go for simplicity, monoculture, then you very soon exhaust the soil. The soil becomes unworkable. So it's in no sense sustainable. I actually now
5 to 5. I don't know how you're doing in terms of what you were putting across.
What's that?
It's 5 to 5.
I'll just say the last thing then. Can I have my last slide on food culture?
Absolutely.
Pity about that because I wanted to talk about food culture at length. Maybe we'll come back to it. But I just wanted to say that we need a cuisine. We need cuisines worldwide that match enlightened agriculture. And what enlightened farms produce, small, mixed, etc. farms, is a great many plants, great many crops, because they focus primarily on arable and horticulture. You don't need a great deal of meat, actually. They don't produce a great deal of meat because they either raise meat on land that's not much good for anything else, in other words, hills and semi-desert and marsh and so on, or they use pigs, for example, and poultry as a way of cleaning up leftovers. So you don't produce all that much meat, but you do produce some, and what you do produce is a very, very high standard, very high quality. But you also, on these mixed farms, produce great variety. And therefore you finish up producing plenty of plants, not much meat, and maximum variety. And I suggest that these 9 words, plenty of plants, not much meat, maximum variety, encapsulate the best of nutritional theory of the last 60 or 70 years. They're all talking about lots of plants, plenty of fiber, all that stuff. And well, there's a great talk that goes with that, but I'll leave it at that. Plenty of plants, not much meat, maximum variety. These 9 words also describe, in essence, the basis of all the greatest cuisines in the world, all the best cooking on an axis from Italy to China, Italy, Turkey, Persia, India, China. They all use meat sparingly. They use it as a garnish or they use it as stock. They don't build their entire cuisine around it. So what I want to say is that there actually is a one-to-one correspondence between the kind of farming we really need to keep the world in good heart and the kind of farming we really need for the best possible nutrition, and between both those things and the world's finest cuisines. That is why there is some cause, even in this modern world, for hope. But so long as we go down the present neoliberal, etc. route, high tech, we've more or less had our chips. So that's it. We need enlightened agriculture and a new food culture. And that's why.
Thank you, Colin. I think I'm handing over to you, James, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
James is not able to get back into the call right now, so I'm going to hand it back to you, David.
Okay. Well, now we're going to hear from Denise, I believe. Isn't that right? So
yes.
Over to you. And I'm sorry, I don't have any information to be able to introduce you. So maybe you could just introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. And I apologize for arriving late. I was depending on an old clock, which was about 15 minutes slow. so I'm sorry for that early anxiety.
A bit of slow time.
So very, I'm a trained ecologist. I farm with my husband and my son here in the Scottish borders. And I've known Colin now since our meeting actually at the Saison, the Raymond Blanc's restaurant in Oxford at the launch of Slow Food UK. So there'll be a wee bit of slow food in what I have to say. But thank you very much indeed, Colin, for asking me to be a guest discussant on this very, very important topic. What I propose to do is to look at, first of all, to tell you about what we do here at Pelham on our farm on the basis of appropriate technology, enlightened agriculture, and an appropriate food culture. So I'll look at it under those headings, and I will then bring in James Hutton, because actually James Hutton is pretty important to all of this, not least the reason, as Colin mentioned earlier, as to why we struck up conversation at that meal at Raymond Blanc's restaurant. So Pelham is 650 acres. We farm here in the southeastern Scottish borders, very close to the sea. The land goes from 200 to about 700 feet. It's one of the driest areas of the UK, and at the moment is very, very dry and very cold by comparison to where it was last year. It's now more a livestock farm, though we do have a mixed element in that we do grow what we call arable silage or whole crop silage, which is a cereal-based silage for our beef. But it has predominantly been a mixed farm. We've been farming here for 30 years. When we first came to Pelham, it had been wall-to-wall arable, and probably rather a bullied farm, and not in very good heart at all. So where we are now is we farm as a family. Our son Angus came into the partnership 5 years ago, bringing his incredible vigor and his ideas and his wonderful imagination to the partnership, which has been challenging at times, but I think for the good. He very sensibly married a farmer's daughter, so we now have the third generation on the farm. But if you want an example of synchronicity and coincidence, just as a very away aside, Angus and my daughter-in-law Helen met on Tinder, which, as you know, is owned by Facebook, incredibly random. They then discovered 3 weeks before they were married that Helen's ancestors are buried in the local graveyard, and not only was her great-grandfather born on this farm, but her great-great-grandfather built the farmhouse. So thank you, Tinder and Facebook, for that. So under the heading, and I am timing myself, under the heading of appropriate technology, what we've done in the 30 years that we've been here is, from a technological point of view, and actually more recently, we've moved from, say, 3 tractors to 1 tractor. We have 2 important pieces of equipment. One is called, basically, it's a feed mixer, which means that we can cut our silage to improve digestibility for our cattle when we house them in the wintertime. We house cattle in the wintertime because it produces muck for our land. We also have a straw chopper, which means that we can chop the straw and use that more effectively in our overwintering. So really, most of our equipment is for overwintering cattle, and we carve indoors. We're in the middle of carving right now. We propose to carve out of doors next year, which is going to actually make us even less reliant on equipment. And this is part of our journey, and our time on Pelham has been a journey. When we do tillage, we actually use contractors. So there is an external cost of contracting for tillage. We also buy in organic feed for our pigs. So that's another external cost that we don't keep within our farm. And although it's all organic, whereas it's actually not all UK. And in fact, it does include soya, which some of it comes from India, and in the past, some has come from China, still organic. A lot of the wheat in the past has come from the Ukraine, still organic. But these are issues that we're addressing, and I can talk about that in more detail. We have sheep. We used to, until recently, breed our own sheep, but what we do now is we buy in what are called stores. So we've reviewed and modified the way we farm in order to really fit our labor profile, which essentially is my son Angus, my husband, me, and one full-time farm laborer. But we share the market, if you like, with other organic pasture for life farmers. So in that way, because we share and we cooperate with them, we are increasing the market. So the next move in terms of tractor purchase is to go back to a nuts and bolts tractor, because most, in fact, all tractors now are GPS dictated. And one of the astonishing things about modern farm equipment is that a lot of it is designed by agricultural engineers around the use of glyphosate and the application of nitrogen. So my son Angus has very energetic discussions with the local machinery agent, discussing the long-term viability of tractors and equipment designed around the application of glyphosate and high nitrogen. So the only tractor manufacturer that is currently producing a nuts and bolts tractor, John Deere. So he is currently looking for John Deere tractors that are not computer dictated, so that we can fix them. At the moment, a tiny glitch in the software in a tractor, and you have to get a computer software expert, not a mechanic, to come and fix your tractor. So that is all very inappropriate technology in terms of what Colin is talking about. And also so much farming now, industrial farming, is precision farming. And of course, the idea of precision farming is that you use finite resources, agrochemicals, with more precision. And of course, there's a very good intent there, but precision farming is GPS dominated and is centralizing control. And just one local little story to put that into some kind of perspective. A local farmer bought a very, 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 very expensive state-of-the-art combine not long ago, and it broke down in the middle of harvest. And in desperation, because he was cutting grain for other farmers in order to regain the cost of the combine, he tried every single possible agent, mechanic, manufacturer, couldn't get any help. One of the agents then phoned the main manufacturing agent to say, look, this guy's combine has broken down, what's he do? And the answer was, tell him to pay his bills and then we'll switch it on again. So the GPS control in Holland had control of this man's combine here in the Scottish borders. So that gives you some idea of the level of control of farm machinery. And we can talk about that in greater depth later on. So that's appropriate technology. We're definitely moving more towards the kind of technology that Colin refers to, but there is a great swathe of very inappropriate, dangerously inappropriate technology. In terms of enlightened agriculture, when Chris and I came into farming as new entrants in 1989, we wanted to go organic from the word go. Chris's background is in agricultural economics, mine is as an ecologist, but initially, in fact, we couldn't afford it until the CAP reform of 2002, and we went organic as soon as we could after that in 2005. So we've been organic for 16 years, which immediately brought huge benefits in terms of cost. The next big step in terms of enlightening our agriculture was to go pasture for life. And we've been pasture for life certified for 6 years. So we don't feed any grain at all to any of our ruminants. So sheep and cattle are only grass-fed and grass-fattened, and grass from our own farm. So that is a complete cycle. And our approach is that actually we don't farm our animals or our land. We farm with them. So we farm with our livestock, just as they farm with us, and we farm with our land just as our land farms with us. Our livestock dictates the pace, we don't. Our soils dictate the pace, we don't. And that's all about, if you like, the free assets of our farm, which is the water, the soil, and the grass. So much of our farming approach now, and we're learning, is free asset management. And that brings a completely new paradigm to the way farming takes place and what we are exploring and part of our journeys to where we are. And over the last 30 years, this farm has demonstrated to us its natural capacity for productivity. And we've responded to that. And we have seen the benefits. And again, I can talk in more detail about that. We have good productivity. Our beef cattle, just on grass, gain what's called, and Colin will know this from the farm, but very, very good live weight gain. We are gaining over 500 kilos in 19 months. And that is the same, that matches other intensive beef producers who are feeding grain. So we've got the productivity we want and we need on our farm without pushing beyond the farm's capacity to produce for us. What we're doing now also in terms of pasture for life, we are mob grazing in rotation. So we move our cattle in quick rotation across grass. And also we are defer grazing in rotation. So we defer grassland in rotation. So we leave grassland, we leave grass fields, sometimes for 10 months just to be grass, and then we graze it. And certainly when we look at, for example, the earthworm population, it's really phenomenal. So that's what we're doing. So we're working with our livestock to help us restore the ecosystem capacity and function of our farm. We need to talk about pigs perhaps in more detail as well. Outdoor pigs, and I noticed Anna Heaton was on in one of the attendees, and I'd love Anna's response to this. Outdoor pigs are not good for soil, depending on the soil type. So we've found over the years, and we've had pigs for 30 years, outdoor pigs, and we had rare breed tammers for years and years and years, that the impact on the soil was so great, we were having to work very hard with very highly mechanized equipment to restore soil. So what we do now, we've reduced our pig herd and we're sharing our production with another organic farm that is working on sand, actually up at Aberdeen, not far from Findhorn, incidentally, where he doesn't have to go to so much trouble or fuel miles to restore soil. So we're sharing the environmental burden of outdoor organic pig production with another farmer, having some pigs on our farm. And incidentally, we also use what is questionably called cull, our cull cows and our cull sheep and our cull pigs, our cull sows. We use all of that, and I'll explain why just in a minute. So nothing goes to waste. We use all the animals that this farm produces, apart from the working males, so working bulls, working tups, working boars. They produce very bad meat, very smelly meat. So I'm afraid we don't use those. But again, more of that later. Okay, so we've done appropriate technology, looked at enlightened agriculture. Now looking at appropriate food culture, Chris and I had a vision when we first started farming that we wanted to sell direct. So we did that in a very small way until we realized, actually, really after attending the first Terra Madre and the Salone del Gusto in Turin in 2002, that we really had to push this very hard. And we built our own butchery in 2008. So we wanted to produce meat of the place. The French call it terroir. And we wanted to share the productivity of our farm directly with our community. So just checking the time, 12 minutes, right, okay. Petra mentioned slow food. Slow food has been very, very important to us in developing our whole level of confidence in producing direct. Good, clean and fair absolutely is what we need to do and what we're endeavouring to do. So we built our own butchery. We took on apprentices. We've worked with the Scottish Meat Training to produce a craft. Basically, we have Scottish craft butchers that we've mentored with assistance from other Scottish craft butchers. So in our butchery and on our farm, we are working with basically, it's about meaningful work. We actually took our butchers to Italy and we worked with slow food in Udine, northern Italy. And the slow munieris have come to Pelham to work with us. So we've shared a food culture with the Italians and learnt how to add value to our pork and our beef and our lamb in terms of charcuterie. So we do a lot of that as well on the farm. So I want to look now in terms of appropriate food culture, the issues of quality, nutrition and gastronomic value, again, which Colin lists. There's a very, very important link between quality, nutrition and gastronomic value and welfare. If you stress an animal 24 hours before it goes to the abattoir and it is slaughtered, you will produce a very poor quality meat. So as much for the sake of welfare and the mutual respect that we have for our animals, we've actually designed, based on Temple Grandin principles, a state-of-the-art handling system so we can handle our livestock with as little stress as possible. It is unfortunate to us that we have to transport our animals to an abattoir, and we would much rather there was slaughter here on the farm, but that's another story. So we avoid stress. The other thing that we've picked up, and this links to quality, nutrition, gastronomy and welfare and issues of justice, is very lean animals, i.e. continental breeds, or breeds that have had the fat bred out of them in order to make them more lean, stress more easily. So when we choose our bulls, our Aberdeen Angus bulls, we choose them for high intramuscular fat, and we focus on an older genetics that actually has a high fat content in the meat. And also ease of carving, but of course, they always carved easily. So we find that if there are high levels of intramuscular fat in our beef, our lamb, and our pork, there's less stress, there's higher quality. Beef and lamb and mutton, we can hang for much longer. And when it comes to pork, it makes much better pork and much better charcuterie. You need high fat to produce good charcuterie, otherwise it dries out too quickly. So when it comes to justice, we also think of the people who work with us. we think the people who work with us are actually our most important resource. So justice is as much for working with our animals on our farm as with the people who work on our farm and share the meaningful work with us on our farm. Cruelty, we respect the 5 freedoms. And as I've already mentioned, there's a very, very direct link between stress and quality and gastronomic value. When it comes to the tiny bit of the biosphere that's here at Pelham, we have an active program of habitat restoration and working with nature here on our farm. Our biodiversity hotspot on the farm, I've been measuring it since we farmed here. It's grown by 20%. We watch indicator species with the RSPB, and we've got all the correct indicator species for a functioning agri-ecosystem. So I'm not halo polishing. I'm just simply saying that it can be done, and it is being done. And we're doing it here at Pelham. And certainly if we can do it, a lot of others can do it. I now want to bring James Hutton into it. And quickly, David, quickly looking at time, I'm now at 18 minutes. Can I quickly bring James Hutton in?
Yes, no, do. And I think then what we'll do is that we'll then have a 3-minute bio break, and then we'll go straight into questions. But do finish on James Hutton.
Yeah, okay. So now James Hutton was a farmer. And the irony is that actually the top of our farm looks over where he farmed. So he was a Berwickshire farmer in the same locale as we farm. I learned about James Hutton after a riding accident, and I was in hospital for 7 weeks with a broken back, and a friend came in and told me, a botanist actually, about James Hutton. I had no idea who he was. But of course, James Hutton was a farmer and the father of modern geology. He was a devout deist, as a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment members were, and he was the most illustrious, probably the most illustrious member of the Scottish Enlightenment. And his great friend was Joseph Black, the founder of carbon dioxide. He was a great friend of Adam Smith. He very definitely knew David Hume, though there's quite an interesting backstory to that. So, you know, he was, his farming basically, and acute sense of observation, he recognized that the earth was much older than the 5,000 years that was purported at the time. And he presented his theory of the earth after about 25 years of hesitation, the same length of time as it took Charles Darwin to present his Origin of Species. But James Hutton presented his theory of the earth to the Royal Society of Edinburgh after 25 years, that basically our earth is aeons old. No vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. He was always experimenting, but the most important thing, he was very convivial. And the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, most of it was definitely not done over a laboratory or over a petri dish or in a laboratory. It was actually done over a glass of claret or a glass of whiskey. And Joseph Black and James Hutton actually set up what's called the Oyster Club. And most of their, most Enlightenment findings were definitely done late at night over claret. But James Hutton actually wasn't keen on claret. He was really a whiskey man. And in fact, he presented a paper to the Royal Society of Edinburgh on how to make whiskey from carrots. So I think on that, as a deist, he really describes God as the divine mechanic, the divine craftsman. God's finger was writ large in the rocks. And that is really what drove his science. And in a sense, I quickly want to make the point, Colin, in your, and it's not that I take issue with it, but you refer to pre-scientific agriculture and then science-assisted agriculture. But the point is that agriculture has always been scientific. If science is about observation, hypothesis, and testing, we've done it from the word go. We've done it from the first time we noticed seed growing in the ground. So really, it's a journey of science. And the difference is what's happened to science now is power. And actually, its power has changed the emphasis of science. It's not that science has changed, but it's about power. So I'm going to end there, but I'd be really keen to pick up the issue of power and what it's done to science.
Yes.
And basically the way we observe things. So thank you for your patience and giving me so much time.
Denise, that was
22 minutes.
fantastic, wonderfully inspiring. And as it happens, while you were talking, I got this copy of a really excellent book called The Secular Enlightenment by Mark Baker, which I reviewed a couple of years ago, which has a section on the Scottish Enlightenment and mentions Hutton in a couple of contexts, just exactly as you suggested. And I just wanted to mention that in that particular context as well, that there is a surviving Enlightenment society in Edinburgh called the Speculative Society. And this was in 1764. And Sir Walter Scott was secretary of it in the 1770s. Robert Louis Stevenson was a member. A lot of senior judges have been a member. And in fact, Duke of Edinburgh, who just died recently, was the senior honorary member of this. And so that was devoted to over glasses of claret, absolutely, was devoted to the improvement of literary composition and public speaking. And so Hutton would have known that some of these leading figures were also members. So there is a kind of residue going on there. But I just loved your practical experience, your relating what actually is possible and feasible, and how this fits in with Colin's approach. I'm just going to suggest that we take a 3-minute bio break, and then we'll go straight into questions. So see you in 3 minutes.
Okay.
Are we on mute?
Hello, everyone. Anyone have a thought to express or observation? I notice there's a few people here that most people here I don't recognize from any other Perry Center event. Are most people here from the from David Larimer's Scientific and Medical Network?
Heard it's about half and half.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's about half and half. Half of the group are ours and half of the group are David's.
Okay. I'd never heard of Chris Tudge until your email. Sorry, somebody else say something?
It's Colin Tudge.
Or Colin, yes, Colin. I'd never heard of him or his ideas until I got the email from Eleanor. And I've been, in the back of my mind, I'd been wondering all along what David Peate's gentle action referred to. and I sort of intuited that it's along the lines of what Colin has presented.
Yeah, I can send you his book I'll send you his book.
I looked online for Colin's new book, but it's.
But I can send you Gentle Action. Have you read Gentle Action?
Oh, is it a book?
Yes.
Yeah,
So I can send you the
absolutely.
book along with Colin's book. I can send you both of them.
Oh, Colin's book is not yet published. Is that right?
No, it is. We published it. It came out in January. There it is.
Okay.
Colin's holding a copy of it.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I looked online, but I couldn't find it.
You write me an email with your address, okay?
So
Okay.
Eleanor is Gentle Action from the Scientific and Medical Network.
There's David Pete,
Oh, thank you. Who
Yeah.
was that, sorry?
Gentle Action, but it's published by PARI as well, isn't it?
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's a great book, and the whole idea of gentle action is extremely important and I think actually what we've been hearing from Denise is a very good example of gentle action, and I love the idea that she was working with, not working on, but working with, and this seems to me a really seminal idea. Denise, are you there?
Here we go.
No, she's yes. I
Yes.
just take up your your question of power.
Yes.
There's also authority. You know, what has authority, and the two things are related. And so, since the 18th century, there's been a migration away from the power of the church and theology, to the power of science and the authority of science. And a particular kind of science, as we know, has the power, which is it's the pharmaceuticals, it's the agrochemicals, it's big agriculture, big technology, and those powers, as we all know, have been concentrated by neoliberalist process of the power being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. So there's this cartel of Cargill and so on. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. So really what that also implies is a centralization in order to exert this power. And you've exactly illustrated that with this rather horrifying story about the combine harvester.
Combine.
You know,
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. Because this was what Colin, I think, is also talking about is this whole process of decentralization rather than centralization. And the individual farm as an ecosystem, which is within a larger ecosystem of Berwickshire or wherever you you happen to be farming.
There's an irony in the whole idea of concentration of wealth, in that the neoliberals claim to be sort of extrapolating from Adam Smith's original philosophy of capitalism. And actually, Smith's whole thing depends on diversity, a very diverse market, so that competition actually works. And what we've got with neoliberalism is the strong or the big pushing aside all the opposition, so that the end point, the natural end point of neoliberalism is actually the monopoly. And there are sort of rather weak laws preventing monopoly because everyone recognizes it's bad. But nevertheless, that is the trend.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wondered,
Carry on.
sorry, just in terms of power, I kind of want to get back to what drives an individual to make a decision. And funny enough, I've recently, well, to be honest, I couldn't read much more of it. Jared Diamond's Upheaval.
Oh, yeah.
I just had to stop at Pinochet. It was just too ghastly. I will finish it. But he actually quotes Thoreau and the issue of the vanity of recognition, which I thought was very interesting. Because if you think what drives a scientist more than anything is actually being complimented by other scientists. So, what drives a scientist to do more and more and more is actually this sort of and what becomes this really destructive narcissism about being recognized. So I think ultimately this is also about individual journeys and us asking ourselves where we are and what we want. And I mean, I think Andrew mentioned that in his talk, but you know, I think the drive is sort of bringing the nobility back to science, bringing majesty back to farming, and bringing beauty back to nature.
Wonderful tree.
And if scientists, you know, yes, I mean, but I was just very taken about the sort of vanity of recognition, because, you know, we're all susceptible to it. We all, you know, drive ourselves because we actually want to be recognized for what we're doing, but actually we need to question that. So that's really what I sort of was thinking about, the issue of power.
Well, and that's
what drives someone to be powerful.
Well, it applies to obviously being elected to the Royal Society and the British Academy, or the National Academy of Sciences. And so, but you have to be, I mean, as a friend of mine who should be a fellow but isn't, says, well, say it's fellows of the right sort. And so this right sort means you have to think soundly, which means you have to be orthodox. And if you're a little too far out of the off beam, then you've really got no chance of being elected.
Yes, I mean, James Hutton was very unorthodox.
But he probably,
I mean, not only did he have
society, was he? I don't know. He must have been, surely.
Well, he was one of the founders of the Royal Society of Edinburgh.
Of Edinburgh, yes. No, but I mean,
yeah,
but presumably he was a fellow of the Royal Society as well, or not?
No, he wasn't. And the interesting thing there, and it is intriguing, Adam Smith, David Hume, and I'm not quite sure, they took elocution lessons so that they could be not just understood in London, but respected. James Hutton never took elocution lessons. He still spoke with a Berwickshire dialect.
How interesting.
And he still dressed as a farmer. He was eccentric. And I also think, he was dyslexic. That's another issue. Yeah, so, you know, there's also this issue of unorthodoxy and orthodoxy.
Well,
but he was very unorthodox.
We actually had a conference on that topic in Pari in 2007.
Right.
Orthodoxy and heresy, because the orthodox are the people who got the power, and the heretics are the people who choose to think differently.
Yes. Yeah, well, of course, he was called a heretic when heresy was still punishable. But that's another story.
Well, the heretics now, they lose their reputation and funding. And this is happening as we speak with respect to, you know, whistleblowers in the NHS, you know, to do with the whole vaccination process. I mean, that's just an example of something that's going on right now, and dissent suppressed.
Yeah.
Anyway,
should we bring in?
Go in there. Who would like to ask a question? I haven't seen any hands up yet, so I'm just keeping going between the three of us. Ferdinand has put an interesting comment here. Say the three temptations of Christ in the desert: political power, technological power, turning stone into food, and immortality, medical science, reversing ages, curing all ills. So these are the kind of archetypal temptations in the sense that they've been expressed by Ferdinand, which is very nice.
I asked, by the way, I asked David Cayley, who I talked of this morning, about this idea of an interpretation of these temptations of Christ, because the Holy Roman Empire became the antithesis of the Christianity that Christ had conceived, and many Christians today are imperialistic Christians, and this is the antithesis of the Christianity that Illich talked about. David Cayley, back in 2000, David Cayley did a 5-part series with Ivan Illich called "The Corruption of Christianity." And it's about how in the first millennia, Christianity became and you'll find this on davidcayley.com.
Well, how do you spell Cayley?
I'll put a post, or I'll put a link to the series on in the chat. Oh, by the way, I save my chats, and when Eleanor creates a sutra chat session or a sutra chat sessions for us, I'll post a link to the chats, or I'll put the chats there if anybody wants to access anything.
No, that's great.
But,
Put these into resources as well. So I oddly enough, I've just read a book out of the Oxford University Press called The History of the Church Through Its Buildings. And the thing that I learned that I didn't really know before was that there were no grand buildings in Christianity until Constantine became a Christian, and the whole Council of Nicaea set the church up as a politicized organization. Then you start having these enormous basilisks and cathedrals and so on, which symbolize the power. Now, if you want the ultimate symbol of power, I think, in the church for me is the Vatican Museum. And I mean, it's just staggering to go around and see the accumulation of wealth. Anyway, thank you for that. Eve, you had a point you'd like to make.
Yes, I wanted to bring in another element. Colin, in his definition of of agroecology, mentions that a real farm makes a positive contribution to the biosphere. And it seems to me that there are many aspects of farming that potentially do that beyond the production of food. So planting trees, hedgerows, and all kinds of things. But I wanted to mention a project that's being set up by somebody I know. Unfortunately, there was a seminar on that which clashed with this. He's in Australia, and he's setting up a carbon sequestration trial using 12 different techniques. And he claims that it's potentially possible on only 5% of farmland to draw down 100% of our annual global CO2 emissions. And I thought it might interest some people, and that I could put a link or the name of the contact in the chat box. The basis of his work, I think, comes out of anthroposophy. He's an anthroposophical doctor.
Can I just comment on that? It does seem to me that agriculture as a whole is likely to detract from the health of the biosphere as a whole. I mean, it's likely to have a negative effect. So to say that it should be a positive contributor is stating an ideal which is not necessarily realizable. And for example, the planting of trees on farms, commendable though it might be, isn't a substitute for wild woodland, where, for example, in a wild wood, you have post-senescent trees, as they're called, which a forester would get rid of and a farmer would get rid of. But they're actually the trees that contain most of the wildlife, most of the variety of insects, most of the birds, etc. So it's difficult. And you can have a substitute, you can pursue courses like agroforestry, which is extremely important, where you integrate trees with agriculture, and you can get enormous diversity in that kind of way. And things like turtle doves tend to come back, which are getting rare in Britain, when you have agroforestry and so on and so on. But again, it doesn't really substitute for the wild ecosystem. The other thing is that on a farm, a good mixed farm of the kind that Denise is describing, you do get enormous concentrations of wildlife, enormous diversity. And the same is true, for example, of suburbs. Some of the most diverse ecosystems in terms of diversity, species diversity, are suburbs. And the reason for that is because that's where you get lots and lots of wild ecosystems coming together. I mean, the sort of buildings are substitute cliffs, and all the trees that people plant are substitute woods, and so on and so on. But again, what you find in a suburb is that the diversity you get in the suburb tends to be the same wherever the suburb is, up to a point, really. So it's very diverse, but it's repeated loads and loads of times. Whereas the diversity you get in nature is a whole range of different ecosystems, which might not have as many species individually, but actually between them have many more species. So it's always you're always a bit, I would say, fighting with agriculture to make it genuinely a positive contributor to the biosphere, but that has to be your ambition.
Yes, which I think Denise aptly illustrated. Jeremy, you'd like to say something? Do you know, I need to ask you to unmute? That should be. Yeah, you're still muted, Jeremy, sorry.
Am I?
You aren't now. No, now you're on.
No, fine.
So you better rewind.
This may be a point to carry forward to the fourth session, which sadly I can't join. But it struck me that there is an important link between Colin's Tolstoy story, the beginning, and Denise's account of working with the land, with the farm, rather than working the farm. And that is that the lost faculty of mind and soul that has to do with the contemplative and the mystical element of life. So I just throw that out to perhaps carry it forward to session 4.
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, the E.F. Schumacher, who's been quoted this afternoon, he distinguished between what he called a science of manipulation and a science of understanding. And we've inherited this neoliberal ethos is manipulation and exploitation. So an economics of exploitation and the science of manipulation. Hence all the engineering analogies, as if you can engineer nature without there being, knock-on effects in inverted commas, i.e., systemic effects. Thank you.
One of the nice, sorry, go.
No, carry on.
I'd say one of the nice things about James Hutton, which I'm sure Denise will agree with, as she said, he was fundamentally a deist, I think quite a deeply religious man. But one of the things, a passage which I like to quote is when he's talking about volcanoes. And he says, look, volcanoes are fundamentally destructive. And I don't believe, he said, that volcanoes can be destructive because they are God's work, and God wouldn't make a destructive thing like that. So the question that he then asked was, what was God's purpose in making volcanoes? And the conclusion he came to was that by throwing up lava from the center of the earth or wherever it came from, you would be creating new land, and that the land, the new lava that you throw up over time decays and forms soil. So the volcano, as he saw it, was a way of creating new soil that plants and so on could grow on. At the same time, you've got erosion going on, which washes the soil eventually into the sea. So he saw volcanoes as a kind of renewal process. Now, the interesting thing is, one of the interesting things is that the question, what is God's purpose, was prompted obviously by religious urgings, his feeling that God must have a purpose. But actually the conclusion he came to, that the volcano is turning round the rock of which the earth is composed and making new soil, is very similar to the modern idea that without plate tectonics, which produces volcanoes on a sort of grand scale, the earth would not continue to be productive, because it's this constant renewal of minerals and stuff that makes it work. So by thinking theologically, he actually anticipated modern science, and that actually happens all the time. Do you know John Hedley Brooks' book, Science and Religion?
Yeah,
just very.
That's brilliant.
Argues, that there is a two-way dialogue between religion and science right from the outset. Religion often poses the questions that science addresses, and then science actually feeds back into religious understanding.
Thank you. I see in the chat we've got some mention of Fukuoka and the Japanese farmer. Do either of you had anything you'd like to say in that respect? The one straw revolution.
What, me?
Well, I mean, somebody's asking about Fukuoka and the one.
Sorry, I mentioned Fukuoka. I know Petra mentioned Fukuoka too. Just because I had the opportunity to write something about Fukuoka and his introduction to India through the work of, I think, a person called Agarwal, Agarwal, I can't remember exactly the name, and how the application of his methods at the Rasulia Center in Madhya Pradesh led to them achieving independence. You know, the whole community became fully independent with their food production. But my question was, in Larry Korn's introduction to the One Straw Revolution, the copy that I have, there's this distinction made between organic farming and natural farming. I was just wondering whether anybody has any sort of any insight into that. Sorry?
Farming.
So between organic farming and natural farming.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
One, I can't remember the name of the author actually, because I can never remember Japanese names. But I remember reading a passage of his in which he said, what we should be asking is why we do anything at all in farming. Why don't we just go with what's there? And he gives a wonderful example. I mean, he succeeds in doing this. It's very complicated and difficult, but he gives a wonderful example about trees. He says, if you never prune a tree for fruit production, for example, you never need to prune it. Mm-hmm. I thought about this and I thought this sounds most unlikely. This sounds sort of a romantic flight of fantasy. Of course you need to prune it. But when you think about it, it's obvious, because if you look at a wild tree, it has a lead shoot and you get what's called apical dominance. And the lead shoot shoots out hormones which ensure that all the other branches don't get, in other words, behave themselves and form a proper shape. And if you do that, you get a nice space between the branches and the bees can pollinate and all that kind of thing. Once you cut off the apex in order to the height of the tree, make it more manageable, you lose apical dominance, and then all the other branches go absolutely mad and start producing things all over the place, and the tree turns into a kind of thicket. And then the you can make it possible for any kind of pollination or anything else to happen is by constantly pruning off all the things that you've allowed to get away. And he applies this principle across the board too.
Yes, I heard I seem to remember that I read about that through Fukuoka and the story of him taking over his family's farm in Japan. They were farming, I think, Satsuma oranges or something like that. And the farm was very, very old. I mean, I think the family had been farming for 1,500 years. And I think when he took it over, and he as a young microbiologist in Yokohama, taking over the farm and applying all these ideas that he was having, the first thing that he managed to do was to kill all the trees on the farm. And it took him decades to actually really get the thing back on track. But according to his principles of no tillage, no pruning, no fertilizers, just what he calls natural farming. So, I mean, yeah.
And you mentioned that the microbes in the soil. I mean, one of the great downsides of agrochemical farming is you destroy the microbes. And now people are beginning to realize at last, about 150 years after Pasteur, 170 years after Pasteur, that these are the key players, that these are the things that make it work. So this is his example on a grand scale of just restoring nature, really, just letting it do its thing.
But my question really was around inorganic farming. Are we still using fertilizers? Because this is the big thing about Fukuoka. He was getting away from the use of fertilizers, saying that even though we are using organic fertilizers, they're still fertilizers.
Denise.
Yeah, can I jump the queue?
Come in here.
Okay. Well, I mean, organic farming is quite strictly regulated. So we have, as certified organic farmers, we don't use any agrochemicals. So no GM, no herbicide, no fungicide, no insecticide. So that's absolutely verboten. And it also means that we are strictly third-party audited, and it's a promise we give to our customers. So that's really, it's a regulated system based on the ecology of soil. And then natural farming, for example, you can be an agroecological farmer without being organic. I mean, to be honest, I sometimes struggle with that, but I mean, you know, you can be intensively organic. You can have a very intensive vegetable system without applying any agrochemicals, but you're still using flamethrowers to burn your weeds, and it can still be very intensive, and you can still till the soil. Whereas agroecological farming or natural farming, actually just a little bit as Fukuoka, you don't till the soil, or you use minimum tillage. So the gold standard is organic, pasture for life, i.e. no grain to ruminants, and minimum or no tillage. That's where you have a combination of natural farming and organic, and that really is the gold standard.
It's also what you might call conventional organic farming. Although it's not using agrochemicals, it can be very, very high fertility because you're chucking on the manure, there's no tomorrow, which isn't actually a very efficient thing to do. So you get these massive yields caused by organic fertilizer. That is most unnatural, as nature doesn't have high fertility. We have a very good friend called John Letts. Well, you know him, I think, Denise, an arable thinker. You don't meet many real arable thinkers. And he is developing varieties of cereals which do well in low fertility. In fact, they tend to be old-fashioned varieties because old-fashioned farms weren't as fertile as the modern ones. So, you know, I've got a picture of Bruegel somewhere. I don't know whether we've got it. But anyway, one of the points is that these old-fashioned varieties are very, very tall. And that's why people stopped growing them largely, because they used all their energy growing straw. They don't yield very, very highly. But the fact that they use low, only need very, very, well, no added fertilizer at all, basically. You just plant clover and stuff like that. And you get a reasonable yield. That makes it very economical and very ecologically sound.
Yes, thank you.
We use
Sorry?
Sorry, I'm just adding, we use clover to harvest atmospheric nitrogen, but we also do use the muck from our overwintering cattle for soil condition.
Well, that's sensible.
Just coming back for a moment to what you said about trees, Colin, and of course, all the cherry trees that there are, none of those are pruned. And we have in our, there's a wonderful old pear tree, which is in the middle of a field. And then that produces a lot of, every year that produces a lot of fruit, and nobody's touched it for probably 100 years. I think we'll have time for one more question point from Eve, and then I think we need to wind up.
Yes, I just wanted to add something about natural farming. I'm here on Crete where I live. I know a number of people who are practicing natural farming methods, including I have one living in my house, which is very convenient. And I think most of the points have been made, but it's as much about following nature as leading nature, and seeing what will grow exactly where, seeing what seeds come up, and so on. And when my friend who now works in this way asked his mentor if he could kind of apprentice him, he was given the advice, no, get yourself a little bit of land and sit and look at it for a year at the plants, at the soil, at the insects, at the birds and the wildlife, and then you're ready to start developing.
That's lovely, because of fallow period. It reminds me actually of what David Peat talks about when he arrived in Pari, and he did nothing for 2 or 3 months. I think it's in Gentle Action or in his autobiography. And people were asking what he was doing. He said nothing. But of course, all the creative impulses were flowing. So thank you very much indeed for a wonderful day we've had. A lot of very interesting thoughts, approaches, systems. I love Colin's diagram. I think it's extremely useful in terms of just getting a handle on these 4 different areas and what we can do and the relationship between them. And what we've heard this afternoon in terms of enlightened agriculture, and you do obviously need to read more in the book in order to get more detail. And I don't know whether, Denise, have you written anything or got a website or anything that people could consult?
Yeah, we've got a farm website. So just if you Google Pelham, pelham.co.uk.
May you just put that in the chat, because otherwise people might not know how to spell Pelham.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you. So we'll continue next week for parts 3 and 4. I just wondered whether, Eleanor, you'd like to say anything about upcoming PARI Centre events. James, I think, was going to do that, but if you'd like to say something for the benefit of Scientific and Medical Network members, we'll obviously put all this into the recording email, but over to you if there's anything you'd like to highlight.
Oh, I've been caught off guard, but yes, well, we do have an event coming up in June from the 5th to the 27th of June, and that is called What is Consciousness? So you can find out more information on our website, but we have with us Ian McGilchrist, Basil Hiley, Roderick Main, Gary Lockman. So we do have a great lineup. So I do hope that you can all join us.
And that's on Saturdays, is that right?
Saturdays and Sundays.
Saturdays, okay. Well, obviously we'll put all the details into the recording mailing, so we'll get all that information out to people and reciprocate. So thank you very much indeed. Marathon session for you, Colin, and thanks to Andrew for coming in this morning and Denise this afternoon. I think we've got a lot to think about, but personally I'm going to go and spend a bit of time in my garden and do a little bit of cleaning up and maybe plant some potatoes, so I can report back on that next week. So many thanks to everybody who's attended today. Great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, David.